So, welcome to chapter five. And this is the last chapter that sort of works and builds on the foundation of the understanding global studies and allows us to move forward into exploring some regions and issues. Um, but it's an important chapter because it really does sort of round out all you've learned so far about the various aspects of global studies. So this chapter is basically called, not basically, but it's in fact called Power, Conflict, and Policy. And it's a chapter that basically we'll be exploring the political aspects of global studies. And this is, in fact, in my area of expertise, this is my direct area of expertise, with my emphasis particularly in international relations and comparative politics, which basically is like global politics. And so it's important for you to understand because in the broader context of things, one of the things when people say, well, what's the difference between, say, global studies and international relations or some aspect of political science that deals with, international issues? And I say to them all the time, well, there are certainly cousins. Um, Sorry, I had to stop for a moment. The planes are flying over, and I've been waiting all day to get this recording done, and it's been a very noisy day here for some reason. So uh, hopefully we'll be able to navigate this, but I may have to stop and start intermittently if the planes keep making as much noise, or if there's sirens around or something. Uh, but the important aspect of recognizing that political science and the study of politics is a is directly related, but there are other aspects that or other fields of study that also encompass global studies. So, for example, you could argue that anthropology, history, sociology, psychology, of course, geography, uh, even various ethnic studies classes. There's a lot of different areas that are part of the global studies under the global studies umbrella, including political science. So political science is just one aspect, but under global studies, we look at and explore various avenues of all these different iterations and different types of fields of study to try and understand why things happen the way they happen. So I want to spend a few minutes sort of helping you understand political science. And some of you may have already had political science class. Probably most of you have not had international relations, which is either myself or my colleague teaches, or perhaps you have not had comparative politics. Uh, but in terms of you understanding the importance is what we're trying to get to here. So let me start off just by, when we talk about, well, what is political science and what is politics, right? And usually the answer comes back, well, it has to do with government and the study of governments and how governments do what they do. And that's fairly typical. I can try to continue now that my dog stopped barking. What a moment. Uh, so in the context of understanding politics in this, and we look at it under, as I said earlier, the idea of what government is, and we kind of understand government as and politics as being one and the same, and that is certainly true. But that is a very narrowed and defined way to look at it. In fact, I would argue that a much broader way and probably a better way to look at it is to sort of understand it not just in terms of institutions but also understand it in terms of behaviors or conditions that set up behaviors and patterns of governments and how they do what they do. Uh, and politics in and of itself really has to do with the human interactions that involve, power and conflict. And I would argue that power sometimes leads to conflict, right? Uh, and with this, I would say to you, just to sort of set up this framework, under political science and politics, if we understand power under four different conditions. So four key points of power. And you should write these down because they'll probably help you in any other political science or any type of class like this. The first type of power is called force, and there's actually two different types of force. But the first one that we consider is the physical use of force. If we want to get your attention, I United States brings its tanks up to your border and points them at you and says, do what we want or else, right? That would be the physical use of force. There's also, in the more modern age, a non-physical use of force, which is psychological. And this is like terrorism. So terrorism doesn't always necessarily the physical act of taking action against someone. It also encompasses the the psychological effect or a psychological threat. So if I say to you, well, if you don't do what I want, I'm going to blow up this building, and I tell you that the building that you're in is going to get blown up, then, even if I never launched the weapon to blow it up, your cognitive or psychological response is going to be obviously terrified, and you're going to react based on the information that has been given to you. So those are the two nuanced aspects of force, physical and non-physical, right? And then the next type would be persuasion. And this is when someone makes a persuasive argument to you, giving you both sides of information, and then you can decide for yourself, based on the information provided to you, what you want to do with that. And then the third type is what we call manipulation. It's sort of like persuasion, but the difference is that we withhold information. So I'm trying to sway your opinion by leaving out bits and pieces of information that would be valuable for you to know that may have made you turn right instead of turning left, right? So if I wanted you to turn right, I just leave out the information about what's good on the left. So this is what manipulation is. And this is frequently what we see used today in terms of politics. And by the way, let me just digress for a moment and say to you that the very essence of the definition of power um, is the ability to influence your behavior, to influence the way you behave, the way you vote, what you buy, what you think, how you think. That's all based on what we call power, and that is the ability to influence you. You can make people, if I had a crazy idea to make a stupid T-shirt with some logo on it that somebody who had a lot of money wanted to market, and they could market it to, students between 18 and 22, then I can make a lot of money immediately just because they could say, hey, it's the next greatest thing, drop it on social media, and everybody believes it's great. So then they can influence your decision on what you even go about buying. Um, that's why a lot of times you'll hear us say that power basically I should say politics is every aspect of your life. Everything you do in your life has some political ramification or implication. Um, and then the fourth type of power is what we call like trade or barter. It's the formal word is exchange, but it's like you exchange something for something to get something back, or to negotiate. So, for example, the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, United States and Russia come to the brink of nuclear war, and what happens is we make a deal that we're going to take our Jupiter 2 missiles out of Turkey. This is all done behind closed doors, so nobody wants to look. Everybody wants to save face publicly. So the United States and Russia, or Soviet Union, make a deal that we remove our missiles. They take their missiles out of Cuba. We save the world from everybody speaking some other language or being killed. So these are the types of things that are four different types of nuanced power that are utilized. So physical force, right? Which again, that influences your behavior. Persuasive force, which again influences your decision making. Manipulative force, which also influences your decision making, but perhaps in a negative direction. And then again, as I said, exchange, which is like a barter or trade. Um, and frequently throughout different aspects or crises or events, you might see all of them utilized in some way, shape, or form. It doesn't mean that they apply one, but you can certainly look at events that have happened throughout history, and you could explore or ask the question, which type of power has been utilized given the turnout of that event, right? So that's one of the things that I want to start with this, so you understand the basis of that. Now, under the realm of political science, there are multiple different types of studies that we look at. One is comparative, and particularly in the realm of global studies. So we have comparative politics and we have international relations. And those are the two primary areas that we're going to discuss. Yes, there are lots of other areas, including, of course, American government. There's public administration. There's philosophy, political philosophy, theory. We call it political theory. So lots of, and even law, parts of law that are also political. So there are lots of different subgroups that are under the umbrella of political science and politics. But the two primary ones that focus on what we're looking at are comparative and international relations. So let's start with comparative for a moment. So when we talk about comparative studies or comparative politics, we're really talking about looking at domestic politics outside of the United States. So this is where we go about exploring other countries and how they do what they do. And we usually do this in a sort of a what we use, what we call comparative analysis. And it's very similar when you think about when you compare things. If you went to go buy uh, let's say computers, and you're comparing Apple to let's say Lenovo or something else, right? Well, you're comparing, well, what's good about both computers, so you can make a decision on what you're going to buy, right? So we compare things all the time. In the realm of politics, we do this in such a way where it is trying to understand uh, how countries operate in the way they operate within the framework of their own territories or boundaries. So, for example, usually you'll find that comparative work is usually done in a regional context. So, for example, you'll have political scientists who are Africanist, or those who focus on Latin America, some who focus on Central America and Mexico, others who focus on European politics. Some, in fact, they'll even break them down even further to Eastern European and Western European. Some who do Russia, others do China or Southeast Asia. Uh, I'm a Middle East expert. That's my field of expertise, and so my work has been based in the region of the Middle East. And so everybody's got their nuance, and they within those regions, then they try to explore and compare how countries operate within those regions, why they do what they do, the power structures in those regions, the governmental systems in those regions, how they work, how they relate with one another. And really, it's about, obviously how they're going to keep the global system operating. And so understanding and looking at the nuances of those other countries helps us not only understand our own infrastructure, but also helps us do a better job of diplomacy and dealing with those countries. So being able to look at them internally is an important component. And so with this is why comparative research is so important. And we can do this across lots of different modalities. So we can compare things, like I said, when we're looking at structures of governments, the infrastructure of military, the religious aspects of a country, the historical context, the cultural aspects. We can look at economic structures. So there's all different types of ways, whether they're democracies, non-democracies, those types of things. So we can compare and look at different outcomes and why countries have evolved, including historical too. We look a lot of historical, or what we call empirical evidence, to also look at these things and understand why countries are the way they are. Um, so the comparative study is one of the most important aspects that we look at when we jump into this field and understanding how this field operates. Now, the other area that we look at is what we call international relations. International relations is different than comparative in some ways. In some ways, it's very similar. Uh, but international relations or international politics is sort of where we out examine the behavior of countries outside, again, of our own domestic borders. But it has a lot more to deal with U.S. foreign policy in relation to those countries. So this is where we're trying to take the information that we've gleaned, and basically what happens is the United States has, uh, let me stop this right. Um, so under international relations, the idea is that we utilize foreign policy, which simply means that for every country on the planet, the United States has volumes of information. Some of the bigger countries like China, we probably have volumes and volumes like this. Smaller countries, probably something like this, right? And all the things that we would be looking at with regard to those countries that would help us understand and be able to relate to them, whether we're trying to do trade or whether we have to deal with them on the security issues aspect. Uh, the things that we have to understand about those countries, right? So we call that U.S. foreign policy. U.S. foreign policy, the things that we would be considering and looking at other countries. Like if we were in class, I would be asking you this, but let me just share with you some of the things that we would be considering. So first of all, we would consider, their history, like, how did they get to where they are? We would look at their political structure. Are they democracy, non-democracy? What type? They parliamentary or parliamentary system? Uh, we would look at their economics. What do we have that they might need that we could trade with them, or are they an economic threat? Uh, we would look at of course, their military security apparatus. Do they have nuclear weapons? Are they stable? Are they not stable? Is the infrastructure, are the people inside their country stable? Are they? So these things you have to be able to assess, right? To be able to understand the culture, the religion. Religion's a huge deal, right? In certain countries, that we have to be able to adhere to that. Uh, so understanding the how countries operate internally allows for us to develop a better policy in how we are going to deal with them. And so, under international relations or international politics, there are multiple different subfields, and some of them include like stuff like peace and conflict, international security, foreign policy, international political economy, global organizations like the UN, uh, international law, things like that. So there's all different types of subfields under the international umbrella, international relations umbrella, or international politics umbrella. And so it is important to understand that they all serve a specific purpose, and they all help the international apparatus of our country, which really runs through the State Department. Uh, they are the ambassadors to the world for the United States, and so this is where our diplomatic efforts come from. But in order to do that, even with our allies, not just our adversaries, but our allies, we have all this documentation and data on where they are at, and we always want to be in a position where we are in a better shape for them than they. We want them to need us more than we need them. So it's really important that to understand that in context. Now, under the ideas of both of these ideologies, so comparative politics uh, as well as international relations, there are aspects that you will also be learning about. So let me just digress for a couple of things to share with you a couple of them. So, like under the auspices of international relations, international politics, there are various theories about how human beings view the world. And one is called liberalism or idealism, or one and the same. Sometimes you hear them called one or the other. And basically, it's one of those. It's more of a 20th century term, and basically it's sort of rooted in what we call liberal tradition. And that usually has a lot to do with the institutional framework and behaviors of governments and institutions and how they operate. And it typically takes on a very sort of positive view or idealistic view of human beings and human nature. So it has a lot to do with behavior. So, for example, it sort of assumes that human beings have a capacity to do good, that selfish and violent behaviors come not from human nature, but from institutions that promote behaviors that lead people to do bad things. Uh, that the primary public institution leading to war is the state, because it promotes nationalism and selfish, self-centered interest over the global welfare of people. Uh, and that multilateral action and institutions help to prevent war. So the more that we can talk, like in institutions like the United Nations or other organizations like NATO, the more we can avoid war. And that's usually the baseline of understanding the idea of idealism and liberalism. There's much more to it, but you can read it in the chapter. I'm just trying to give you a little nuanced version of it. The opposite or antithesis of that is what we call realism. And you could argue that realism is sort of denoted by the notion of keeping it real, right? It sort of takes a very pragmatic view of, uh, of human beings and human interaction in the international relations field. Uh, but it has more than that. It's actually, it also refers to, sometimes you'll hear it referred to, particularly in this field, as real politics. And sort of the foundational ideologies stem from actually going back to the 5th century BCE, during the Peloponnesian War, when Thucydides is writing about it. And he's talking about, in fact, you might have even heard of, as some of you, the Malian dialogue, where you have a city-state that is trying to discuss and have rationale as to why the 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 bigger, stronger country, or city-state, which was Athens, should not kill them all off. And basically what it said is that, the weak, they make like the assertion is that Thucydides writes, the weak the weak suffer what they must, and those who are in power do what they need to do to maintain their power. Um, and then throughout history, there have been many other writers who sort of built on this, and certainly you could throw out some names that may not make any sense to you now, but hopefully over your academic career will grow, like Machiavelli and Thomas Hobbes and these individuals who are writing about human nature and human interaction during certain periods of time in history. I always tell my students, even if they're reading about what previous political thinkers are writing, you have to recognize they're only writing at a snapshot in time. They're writing based on the reality of the life that they grew up in, wherever they grew up, right? And then they only had the privilege of looking backward from there, not looking forwards. And they also didn't have access to information like we have today. So for those writers writing back in the Middle Ages, for example, their view of the world, you could understand, was very brutish and rough, and the dark ages and middle ages of Europe were very bitter and tough. And so you grew up in an environment like that, then your view of the world is tainted by your experience and your exposure. And so this is where, the basis of understanding of power politics that we look at today actually derive from. And so if people want to understand how we sort of built our system today, it comes from some of these early thinkers and some of their realities. And there are parts of what they wrote that are absolutely accurate and truthful today. There are other parts that are absolutely not. And it's not that they were wrong, it's that they don't have the privilege of looking at, if you're talking about the Middle Ages, of looking at another 500 years of history in front of them to be able to rethink what they thought about the world. Uh, so some of the basic premise about realist thinking, like I gave you for the idealistic side, the realists sort of believe that human nature is sort of self-interested and power hungry, that the primary entity in world politics is the state, meaning the nation state. Uh, States act as an extension of the humans and therefore are also self-interested and power hungry. So basically it says that we're all basically greedy and looking to basically one up everyone else. States behave as rational actors. They pursue their own self-interest within the limits of their own resources and abilities. That's why it's so important for the United States, for example, to have its own resources or control the resources of other countries to make sure it fortifies its power. And that we justify that because realist thinking, the ideology of realism, promotes that, says that that's okay. Um, States' goals are basically held up as national interest and defined as power. Power is expressed as political, economic, and military force. And then it would say that, hey, of all those, the military force is the strongest. So the United States, you see us always talking about we have the best military, the best technology, and we keep ourselves as the number one leader of military arms on the planet. And that's the way we sort of sell ourselves to the rest of the world. So this is in essence what realism thinks, that hey, you know what, there's got to be a winner and a loser, and it's better for us to win. And so the way we protect our ability to win is to stay on top and be on top of everything else. Now, there's some other aspects that we can also look at here. So under comparative politics, for example, there's a left-wing political systems and there are right-wing political systems. And the left side of things, what we would call, like under Marxist ideology and Karl Marx and his thinking, which basically was the sort of the foundational principles of communism, that are held up, by Vladimir Lenin and these individuals who promote basically the failures of capitalism and the rise of socialism and the rise of people basically taking control of their own viability. The institutions of government would be controlled by groups of people and not by governments who would abuse or corrupt them. Uh, and that but historically the communism has failed, and it has failed for lots of different reasons. But again, I want you to delve into the book a little bit to look at that. But one of the things that I would argue is that it has evolved over periods of time, and the question is, have we ever seen a true communist system ever in existence, even for those that call themselves communists? And arguably many people would say no, because one of the premise of communist systems is that there's no leader. And in every entity, when we've had these groups or countries that have said they were a communist, there's always been a leader in charge, and that's not the way communist systems are supposed to be set up. And that understanding it, that part of the segue to communism was what we call socialism. And, I always tell people, don't be afraid of words. When you hear words like Marxism or socialism or communism, don't be afraid of words. Just because people call themselves a certain thing doesn't mean they operate that way. Like you could argue that communism, the root of the word communism is commune. It's about people helping each other and working collectively together. But what we saw in terms of trying to create that system were people who basically tried to control every aspect of the human beings within their countries, every aspect of their existence. And so then you have what we call a totalitarian or authoritarian system. So in order to try, what they said was trying to get to communism, we are therefore going to control every aspect of your life. So obviously that didn't work out so well, at least historically. There have been instances where people would say in a small experiment that you could make communist systems work, but we have not been able to see it work in fruition so far in history. Uh, Even though China's getting to be a little bit more interesting because they've relaxed their economic sectors and they've been thriving on the economic side, which is propelling their political side. So that's a real threat to the systems of government of the Western world if they can show that they can keep their system in place and have a vital economic base and still be able to run their country. And then on the right wing side of that, you have constitutional monarchies, like the famous old monarchs of old Europe. And these individuals basically, it's interesting because you can have two different types of monarchs, right? And you can have the monarch that is just and a wonderful human being who gets to make decisions and cares about his or her people and is, really has a people's heart. But then you can have the other kind, right? Who could be brutal and brutish and want to control everything. And then you go from being a monarch, well, what we call a monarchy system of government, to being a totalitarian or authoritarian or tyrannical government. There's not much difference between the terms. The tyrant controls everything and basically is self-interested. The monarch basically is interested in protecting their people uh, and can make decisions free of encumberment because there is no governmental system. Now, most of Europe today, as we look at it, is very different because Europe, the monarchs today basically don't have any real power. They're more figureheads. The Queen of England doesn't really have any political power anymore. She sits as more like the ambassador, international ambassador of goodwill. The government is run outside of the realm of those individuals. Uh, but so it's more of a ceremonial title, if you would, now, for most of Europe. It's still important, though. Many people still, regardless of the reality of what's changed over history at a time when the monarch was powerful, still revere and care about the institutional framework of at least having the ceremonial title stay in place. Now, uh, the last thing I just want to say about this as you go through this chapter is just understanding that the international studies in international relations that they for the most part are they are the heart of what we call international affairs, and through all the various aspects that you'll be exploring in this class, understanding the ideas of war, trade, negotiations, international agreements, all those different aspects of understanding human behavior and how those things apply, looking at history and culture and economics and geography are all essential aspects of global studies and are all explain why just politics in and of itself cannot completely explain that answer. That's why through all the previous chapters, you've had to look at and explore different aspects of all these different subgroups. Uh, so I hope you find this to be interesting. Again, politics is the root of all this that we move forward into. And then from here, we'll move into some chapters looking at a couple of different regions, and then we'll finish up looking at some issues within those contexts of those regions. All right, you guys, have a great day. I will see you for the next chapter.